Hello, future Christ Parency here. I had to re-upload this video because as I was working on my Lutheran video, I discovered that I did not include any of the slides in the video, which looking back at it would make it very boring. This is an updated version, including the slides. It's still kind of iffy, but it's still better than having a blank screen the entire video. So I would recommend watching this one over the previous one. I'm going to be replacing it in the playlist with the old one, and then I'm going to put on the thumbnail for the old one that it's outdated and that this is the more updated version. With that being said, let's get into the actual video. As always, before we get into the video, I just want to inform you that I'm going to be going over the Congregationalist denomination, and I am going to be giving out a lot of my opinions. I'm going to be trying to state as many facts as possible to try to be as objective as possible when talking about how the church is, but ultimately this is going to be an opinionated video, so keep that in mind. With that being said, let's go ahead and get into the video. Welcome to Christparency, the channel where we tackle misconceptions and uncover the truth about Christianity. In the landscape of Christian denominations, Congregationalism occupies an interesting place. It is neither strongly centralized like some historic churches, nor loosely defined in the way that many modern independent churches are. Instead, it represents a tradition built around the idea that each individual congregation governs itself under Christ. Historically, Congregationalists played an important role in the religious and political development of early America, and their theology developed through centuries of Protestant influence. While there are many admirable aspects to this tradition, there are also structural and theological concerns that keep it in my ranking somewhat in the middle. It's a respectable denomination in several ways, historically significant, but not without notable weaknesses. So, what are Congregationalists? Congregationalists are Protestants who believe that the local church congregation should function independently without submission to a higher church authority. Each congregation governs itself, makes its own decisions, selects its own leadership, and determines its own doctrinal emphasis. Historically, Congregationalism emerged from the English Puritanism in the 16th and 17th centuries, when some reformers concluded that the structure of the Church of England still resembled the centralized hierarchy of the medieval church too closely. Rather than having bishops or a central authority, Congregationalists believed that the gathered body of believers in a local church should collectively guide the life of the church. This idea eventually spread to the American colonies, where Congregationalist churches became particularly influential in New England. Over time, different branches developed, and many Congregationalist churches today belong to broader fellowships, such as the United Church of Christ or various independent associations. One of the most defining features of Congregationalism is how its theology has evolved over time. Early Congregationalists were deeply rooted in Reformed theology and strongly influenced by Puritan thought. They emphasized doctrines such as the authority of Scripture, the sovereignty of God, and the necessity of personal conversion. However, as the centuries passed, many Congregationalist bodies experienced significant theological shifts. Some churches remained fairly traditional and evangelical, while others gradually adopted more liberal theological perspectives. This divergence became especially noticeable in the 19th and 20th centuries, when certain Congregationalist groups embraced higher criticism of the Bible and more progressive interpretations of Christian doctrine. This theological flexibility has both strengths and weaknesses. On the positive side, it allows congregations to adapt and respond to cultural changes. On the negative side, it can lead to serious doctrinal inconsistency between churches that share the same historical label. Perhaps the most well-known feature of Congregationalism is its rejection of centralized church government. Unlike Episcopal systems, which are led by bishops, or Presbyterian systems, which involve regional assemblies of elders, Congregationalists believe that the authority rests within each individual congregation. Churches may cooperate with other congregations in voluntary associations, but these larger bodies generally do not possess binding authority over local churches. They can offer guidance, provide resources, and facilitate fellowship, but the final decisions remain at the congregational level. This system offers a high degree of autonomy. Each church can choose its pastor, establish its own ministries, determine its worship style, and shape its theological direction. However, this independence also means that unity between churches can be limited. Without a shared authority structure, doctrinal disagreements can easily lead to fragmentation. Congregationalists strongly affirm the Protestant doctrine known as the priesthood of all believers. This principle teaches that every Christian has direct God to access through Christ and does not require a human priest as a mediator. In practical terms, this belief encourages active participation by church members. Lay people often play significant roles in decision-making, leadership, and ministry within the congregation. Church meetings and voting processes are common ways members help guide the direction of their church. This emphasis can create a strong sense of responsibility among members and reinforce the idea that the church is not merely an institution led by clergy, but a community of believers serving together. At the same time, heavy reliance on congregational decision-making can sometimes lead to internal conflicts or leadership struggles if a church lacks clear guidance. Congregationalism played a major role in the early religious life of the United States. Many of the earliest Puritan settlers in New England established Congregationalist churches, and for a time these churches were closely tied to the social and political structures of the colonies. Congregationalist ministers were often prominent voices in public life, and their churches helped shape the moral and intellectual environment of early American society. Institutions such as the Harvard University were originally founded within this broader Puritan and Congregationalist context. Because of this history, Congregationalism holds a unique place in American Protestant heritage. Its emphasis on local governance and participation also paralleled the development of democratic ideas in the political sphere. Although many people associate Congregationalism with simple or informal services, historically the tradition maintained a structured and reverent approach to worship. Early Congregationalist services often followed a fairly classical liturgical pattern that included scripture reading, prayer, preaching, and congregational singing. The focus of worship was typically the preaching of the word. Sermons were often lengthy and doctrinally rich, reflecting the Puritan emphasis on careful teaching and spiritual reflection. While many Congregationalist churches vary widely in style, many still retain elements of this traditional structure. Compared to highly informal contemporary services found in some independent churches, this historical emphasis on reverent worship can be a positive feature for the tradition. At the core of Congregationalist thought is the belief that the local congregation is the final earthly authority in matters of church governance. Decisions about doctrine, leadership, and practice ultimately rest with the members of the church. Importantly, this authority is understood to be fallible. Congregationalists generally acknowledge that no human institution is perfect, including the congregation itself. Ideally, the church seeks to submit to Scripture while collectively discerning the will of God. This system reflects a strong commitment to accountability and participation, but it also creates a potential weakness. When authority is located primarily at the local level, doctrinal standards can vary dramatically from one congregation to another. Some churches may remain faithful to historic Christian teachings, while others may move in very different theological directions. So, why am I not a Congregationalist? It comes down to authority in Scripture. Congregationalism places the final authority for church government within the local congregation itself. In practice, that means each individual church governs its own doctrine, leadership, and direction without being accountable to a higher ecclesiastical authority. While the system strongly protects local autonomy, I believe it also introduces a significant level of instability. Without a broader authority structure to preserve a theological continuity, a congregation can gradually drift in almost any direction. Over time, the beliefs of a church can change dramatically depending on the preferences of its current members. For someone like me who values consistency in doctrine and historical continuity within the church, that lack of structural guardrails makes Congregationalism difficult to fully embrace. This structural openness has also contributed to one of the most unfortunate developments within the Congregationalist tradition, the widespread theological liberalization that has occurred in many of its modern expressions. Many historically Congregationalist bodies, particularly those connected with the United Church of Christ, have moved far away from historic Christian orthodoxy in areas such as biblical authority, sexual ethics, and the nature of Christ. While this does not apply to every Congregational church, the lack of binding doctrinal authority has made it easier for those shifts to take place. What began historically as a movement rooted in the Reformation and in a serious commitment to Scripture has in many places become something quite different. That trajectory is one of the main reasons I cannot rank Congregationalism higher. One of the strongest features of the tradition is its emphasis on the importance of the local church community. Congregationalists place a high value on the gathered body of believers actively participating in the life and decision-making of their church. Rather than leadership being distant and hierarchical, the congregation itself is deeply involved in shaping the church's direction. This emphasis can produce churches where members feel a real sense of responsibility for the health of their community. It reinforces the idea that the church is not merely an institution run by distant authority, but a living body of believers who are collectively responsible for their faith and practice. In that sense, Congregationalism reflects an important biblical principle, that the church is ultimately made up of its people, not simply its structure. Congregationalism represents a significant chapter in Protestant history. Its emphasis on local church autonomy, active participation by believers, and reverence for Scripture helped shape both church life and early American culture. At its best, the tradition encourages responsibility, community involvement, and thoughtful engagement with faith. At the same time, the absence of a strong overarching authority can lead to fragmentation and doctrinal drift. Because each congregation ultimately governs itself, the consistency of belief across the tradition is often difficult to maintain. It contains meaningful historical contributions and valuable principles, but its structural weakness and theological diversity prevent it from ranking among the strongest traditions. It's an important and respectable denomination, yet one that still raises some significant concerns. There we have it. That is my full opinion on the Congregationalist denomination. In terms of recommending it for someone, I personally would not recommend going to one, but I would still say it is a solid denomination. I would put it near the bottom in terms of Protestantism, but I would still put it over any one true church denomination personally. So I would still recommend it over Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy because it's Protestant. And I would just like to say to make sure to join a mainline Congregationalist church if you are interested, like the UCC. Despite its liberalism, it is still mainline and a solid church to go to. Of course, there are other denominations that I personally would prefer over, but in terms of overall feeling, it's a solid denomination. Please go to a mainline Congregationalist denomination if that's what you feel like joining. I hope you guys all enjoyed this video. If I made any mistakes, please do let me know. And I will see you guys very soon. God bless.